promised you a sports lawyer. I delivered one. Here we are. Andrew Nixon from Sheridan's. Thanks so much for your time this evening on the Transfer Show, Andrew.
Pleasure to be here.
Let's get an idea of what goes on behind the scenes with certain transfers. I know you can't comment specifically on this, but I want to start with the big news of the week. It has been Manchester United's deal for Benjamin Sesko.
Yeah.
What kind of work from a legal perspective would have gone into a deal like that, such a big one?
Well, full transparency, I'm actually a United fan, so great to see that deal nearly over the line. Once the agent or the player reps have negotiated the core commercial terms and the clubs have obviously agreed the transfer fee and the transfer fee payment mechanics, then that's when we tend to get involved. And there's really two core components to it. First of all, there's the player's employment contract or the playing contract. And it's important to be clear that largely that contract is pre-baked. It's not capable of being negotiated, save in respect of Schedule 2 of that contract. And that's where, I guess, we come into the fold and we help the player and his representatives negotiate and also bake those terms into the contract. And obviously that covers a whole range of remuneration aspects in terms of the player wages, in terms of player bonuses, but also in relation to loyalty payments or loyalty bonuses, they're sometimes referred to, and also signing on fees. And the second component, which is arguably or often the chunkiest piece of work, is in relation to the player image rights. Under the standard form player contract, certain basic image rights are licensed up the chain to the club, but obviously for a club like Manchester United and signing a player as high profile as Sesko, there'll obviously be a negotiation in relation to the scope of those rights and what Manchester United will be able to do with those rights in terms of their own commercial portfolio. Andrew,
you touched on it there, but clearly he's going to be paid very, very well for a move from RB Leipzig to Manchester United.
Yeah.
But you touched on bonuses there. We always hear about these goal bonuses, appearance bonuses, win bonuses. Are those kinds of bonuses still prevalent in modern contracts, or is it more a team ethic where these bonuses are gleaned from?
No, I mean, performance pay has always been part of the picture, and in fact it remains prevalent now, and in fact increasingly so, particularly with the advent of data and analytics, I guess, feeding into how these deals are done. But in terms of how Schedule 2 might look of the player contract, yes, there'll be personal and individual performance bonuses around goals. That might be broken down into tiers depending on how many goals are scored in a certain tier. So 10, 10, 10, it tends to be how it works. But also in relation to the loyalty side as well, that tends to be spread across the term of the contract. And as we said at the top of the show or the top of the session, obviously the signing on fee is also a part of that as well. And you touch upon appearance payments, or sometimes referred to as appearance bonuses. That tends to work based upon the principle of a ratchet on a salary, based upon hitting a certain number of Premier League games. So it tends to be around 25. But there's also an interesting negotiation over that, because from the player perspective, you want to activate that payment, or at least activate the appearance as soon as the player steps on the field of play, whereas obviously the club might want to narrow that and obviously attach the activation to a start as opposed to just an appearance.
Yeah. How busy is the transfer window for you? And who do you usually represent? Is it the club or is it the player?
Dealing with the second question first, we tend to work player side, and that's really just a case of supply and demand, because obviously most of the clubs are obviously very well serviced by excellent in-house legal teams and excellent in-house football operations departments. So just by dint of the market, that tends to be where our flow of work comes from. So it tends to be player side work. And in terms of how busy we are, August is obviously a super busy month, July as well, and it's quite interesting as a month. It does to run in phases or waves. You've talked about obviously Liverpool's transfer strategy on the show earlier on, and obviously clubs like that are unencumbered by cash flow issues or issues in respect of PSR are obviously able to go to market and do deals pretty quickly. Then you have the flow of deals in relation to those clubs which I guess have to cut their cloth accordingly and perhaps need to get players out in order to get players in. And then obviously the third phase tends to be what we would call the 11th hour melee at the end of August, which is obviously getting a number of deals done in a short space of time and meeting the registration deadlines. And that bit is quite interesting because when you talk about football transfers, and obviously you've talked about it on the show, people tend to think in terms of very high profile players with big image rights deals. At that part of the window, you're often doing deals in relation to players who aren't necessarily household names, but nevertheless no less important for the clubs involved.
Are you able to tell us what you've worked on this window at all?
And I'm not going to go into any specifics as much as I'd like to. But look, we're obviously privileged as a team and as a firm to work on some of the biggest transfers, and that actually segues into the women's game as well. We're very fortunate to do a lot of work in women's football, and obviously with the success of the Lionesses, we expect to see a bump in the WSL transfer dealings up to their window closing on the 4th of September.
Andrew, let me tell you, you're earning your bonuses so far, and there's plenty more to come from Andrew Nixon after the break, including his take on confidential release clauses. Stay with us. Yeah, welcome back to the Transfer Show. Michael Bridge is still here, and he's been discussing his image rights with the sports lawyer from Sheridan's, Andrew Nixon, who is still with us. Andrew, just give us an idea what represents the biggest challenge as a sports lawyer for you during a transfer window.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, we foreshadowed this earlier, but towards the end of the window, that kind of 11th hour melee, as I described it as, it tends to be a combination of volume of deals plus time pressure. So that does obviously create its own challenges. And there's obviously ways around that. You can obviously submit deal sheets to extend time, but that is obviously a challenging time for any lawyer in this space. Beyond that, in terms of more high profile deals where there isn't time pressure, albeit there's always time pressure in reality, it is quite often working out and pulling in all of the different network of advisors that work on these deals. As the lawyer in these deals, you tend to be at the epicenter of it, but you're also pulling in commercial advisors and obviously tax advisors, particularly in relation to the image rights structuring piece, but also increasingly, and this is really fascinating, and I mentioned this earlier, is in relation to data and analytics advisors who play a role in terms of potentially ratcheting up the value of the contract because they're able to demonstrate and provide evidence to clubs as to the players' on-field value, future-facing, but also the players' off-field value, future-facing. So kind of dealing with that kind of network of advisors is obviously a challenge, albeit it's one we're pretty equipped to deal with now.
Fans often get frustrated about deals taking their time.
Yeah.
What can you tell them? Be more patient.
Well, yes, there's
patient.
Get that, because obviously football and sport in general is obviously an emotional thing. But if you look at it through my eyes or the eyes of any lawyer, you look at it very dispassionately. And when you take a step back, the reality is you're dealing with a transaction which involves the sale and acquisition of a very significant asset in consideration for very significant sums of money, cumulatively often tens of millions of pounds, and add into that a web of legal and regulatory and tax issues. You have a very complex deal and deal structure. So when you look at it through that lens, actually when you think about it, these deals get done incredibly quickly, and a lot of that is down to the brilliant work that clubs do and football operations teams at clubs do. So whilst I get the kind of the emotional fan's eye element, the reality is these deals get done pretty quick.
What about clauses then? How time consuming can they be, and problematic? There must be some strange clauses.
Yeah, I mean, the negotiation of a contract, throughout the course of it presents its own challenges because so many of these provisions are robustly negotiated. But if you were to kind of identify a couple, relegation clauses can be a real challenge, particularly certain clubs who maybe further down the Premier League pyramid obviously need to protect themselves against a relegation event. And obviously that often means or could mean players obviously suffering a significant deduction up to maybe 50% of their salary and remuneration. So those clauses can be challenging to negotiate. And obviously, I think you foreshadowed this earlier before the break, release clauses as well, sometimes referred to as buyout clauses, albeit there are subtle differences between those two. But release clauses can be challenging. There's no question about that, and how you set that release clause.
I want to pick up on that because on a particular case in this transfer window, I know Michael Bridge is still haunted about this one. Tottenham Hotspur thought they got Morgan Gibbs-White, and the Nottingham Forest said a confidential release clause effectively had been breached. Have you heard of confidential release clauses, and how easy is it to keep a release clause confidential?
Well, every clause of a contract is confidential unless it is expressly stated not to be confidential. So there's your legal starting point. I mean, it is, you've actually hit upon the really kind of challenging aspect here, because obviously if you set a release threshold, then applying a dose of logic, you would want or expect other clubs to be aware of that, because obviously there's a reason why that threshold has been set at that level. But equally, if you look at it from the club's perspective, you can see why they would want to keep it confidential. But ultimately, if you're going to create or set a release threshold, then there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of point in cloaking that in confidentiality, which is actually, it's really important to be aware of that when you're negotiating player side, because if you don't tackle that, then it generally will just be caught by the confidentiality provisions in the contract.
Time has caught us up, Andrew. Thank you so much for
Pleasure.
your time. Michael, terrific, image rights. Before we go, a big story coming out of the WSL this evening. We understand